Her billionaire husband put his mistress on the Christmas card she filed in January. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The first time Naomi Brooks saw her replacement, she was standing beside her husband on a Christmas card. Not in a rumor, not in a whispered warning, not in some careless photograph taken across a restaurant window, but printed on thick ivory cardstock with gold foil around the edges and the Whitmore family crest pressed at the top like a royal seal. The envelope had arrived just after sunrise, laid carefully on the silver tray in the foyer of the Whitmore estate, while snow softened the long driveway outside and the pine trees bent beneath December frost. Naomi had been awake since 5, as she often was, answering emails for the charity auction, reviewing donation pledges, making sure every family on the winter relief list would receive coats before the temperature dropped again. She wore a cream sweater, no jewelry except her wedding ring, and her dark curls were pinned loosely at the back of her neck. The house was still quiet, that expensive kind of quiet found only in rooms too large for the people living inside them. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, the housekeeper who had worked for the Whitmores for nearly 20 years, stood near the staircase with her hands folded, watching Naomi with a sadness she tried to hide. "The printer sent the final proof, ma'am," she said softly. Naomi smiled because she still believed, in that small morning moment, that the card would show what it always had: Charles Whitmore in his tailored navy coat, Naomi beside him in winter white, the grand stone house glowing behind them like a promise they had spent 10 years building. But when she lifted the card, the world narrowed to a silence so sharp it seemed to cut the air from the room. Charles stood in the center, handsome and composed, his silver-streaked hair perfect, his hand resting lightly on the waist of Madison Pierce, the young communications director who had begun appearing too often in meetings, too often in private calls, too often in places where a wife should not have to wonder. Madison wore red. Naomi noticed that first. A polished, victorious red. She was smiling as if she belonged there, as if the house, the name, the holiday, and the man had all been handed to her without consequence. Beneath the photograph, in elegant script, were the words, "With warmest wishes from Charles Whitmore and family." Family. Naomi read the word once. Then again. Her thumb moved over the raised gold lettering, and for one breath, she felt the whole marriage reveal itself as something carefully staged and quietly hollow. 10 years of standing beside Charles at hospital openings, scholarship dinners, boardroom receptions, and Christmas galas. 10 years of helping soften his sharp edges for cameras. 10 years of writing speeches he delivered as if compassion had been his idea. And now, with one card, he had not merely betrayed her. He had edited her out. Evelyn took a half-step forward. "Mrs. Whitmore." Naomi did not look up. Her face remained calm, but something behind her eyes changed, not breaking, not burning, simply becoming still. She placed the card on the marble table, slipped the diamond ring from her finger, and set it beside the photograph with a sound so small it felt louder than thunder. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past the gate, carrying hundreds of identical envelopes toward friends, investors, board members, donors, and every smiling person who believed the Whitmore marriage was as flawless as the holiday card made it seem. Naomi looked at the woman and read, then at the empty space where she should have been, and her voice, when it came, was quiet enough to be mistaken for grace. "If he wants a picture-perfect lie," she said, "I'll give him a legally perfect ending." For nearly 10 years, the world had believed Charles and Naomi Whitmore were the kind of couple people whispered about with admiration. Their marriage looked polished from every angle. The billionaire chairman with his quiet confidence, the graceful black woman beside him whose presence made every cold room feel human. In magazine profiles, Charles was called visionary. At charity galas, he was called generous. But Naomi knew how carefully those words had been built. She remembered the first winter after their wedding, when Whitmore Holdings had nearly lost a major hospital partnership because Charles had spoken about poverty as if it were a business inconvenience instead of a human wound. Naomi had stayed awake until 2 in the morning rewriting his speech at the kitchen island, changing sharp sentences into honest ones, replacing numbers with names, reminding him that behind every donation was someone trying to survive with dignity. The next day, cameras flashed as Charles delivered her words to a standing ovation, and when he stepped off stage, he squeezed her hand beneath the table and whispered, "You make me sound like a better man." Back then, she thought it was love. Years later, she understood it had been a warning. The estate was filled with proof of the life they had performed together. Along the upstairs hallway, framed photographs traced their marriage like a public exhibit. There they were at the children's wing opening in Chicago, Naomi in pale blue, Charles smiling because she had reminded him to kneel when speaking to the little girl in the wheelchair. There they were in Aspen, hosting a winter fundraiser where Naomi had persuaded wealthy guests to sponsor heating bills for hundreds of families across 3 states. There they were on the cover of a local business journal, his arm around her waist, the headline praising his heart for service, though the service had always been hers before it became his. At first, Naomi had not minded standing slightly behind him. She had believed marriage meant helping each other become more whole. She had believed her softness could teach him gentleness. Her faith in people could loosen the iron gates around his heart. But somewhere between the 5th anniversary and the 7th, Charles stopped asking what she thought and started telling her where to stand. He chose her dresses for interviews, corrected her tone before donor meetings, and once, after a luncheon in Boston, told her she had spoken too personally about families facing eviction. "People do not come to these events to feel uncomfortable," he had said in the back of the car. Naomi had looked out at the rain sliding down the window and answered, "Maybe they should." That was when the distance began showing up in photographs. Not enough for strangers to notice, but enough for a wife to feel. His hand moved from her waist to the back of her chair, then to his pocket. His smile turned toward cameras before it turned toward her. At dinners, he praised Madison Pierce for understanding modern image strategy while Naomi sat across the table, listening to another woman receive credit for ideas Naomi had planted years before. By December, the mansion had become a museum of quiet erasure. Her favorite jazz records were moved from the sitting room to a storage cabinet. Her mother's quilt disappeared from the guest suite because Madison thought it clashed with the holiday decor. Even the Christmas tree in the main hall had been redesigned in silver and white, stripped of the handmade ornaments Naomi had collected from shelter children every year. Standing in that hallway after seeing the card, Naomi finally understood the truth with painful clarity. Charles had not replaced her in a single photograph. He had been removing her from the marriage one careful inch at a time. And the cruelest part was that he still expected her to smile while disappearing. By 6 o'clock that evening, the Whitmore estate no longer felt like a home. It had become a stage. Blacktown cars curved up the snow-lined driveway in a slow procession of wealth, their headlights gliding across the frozen lawn while valets in wool coats opened doors for senators, donors, board members, and old money couples who greeted one another with careful kisses and colder eyes. Inside, the grand ballroom glowed beneath crystal chandeliers, every garland measured, every candle placed, every silver ornament reflecting the kind of perfection that could only be purchased by people afraid of disorder. Naomi stood at the top of the staircase for one quiet moment before descending. She had chosen a simple black dress with long sleeves and a narrow waist, not because she wanted to mourn, but because she refused to compete with a woman who had mistaken attention for victory. Around her neck, she wore her mother's small pearl pendant, a reminder of the woman who had once told her that dignity was not something the world gave you. It was something you carried even when the world tried to take everything else. The conversations below softened as Naomi entered the room. Some guests smiled too quickly. Others looked away too late. The card had already begun its work. She could feel the questions moving through the crowd like winter air under a door. Where had she been? Why was Madison in the photograph? Had Charles finally stopped pretending? Across the ballroom, Charles stood beside the fireplace in a charcoal tuxedo, one hand holding a glass of sparkling water, the other resting far too comfortably near Madison Pierce. Madison wore the same shade of red from the card, bright against the white roses and silver linens, a color chosen not for beauty but for announcement. When she saw Naomi, her smile did not fade. It sharpened. "Naomi," Madison said, crossing the room with polished sweetness. I was not sure you were coming tonight. The words were soft enough for manners and loud enough for witnesses. Naomi looked at her for one measured second. It is my house, she said. The silence that followed was brief, but beautiful. Charles appeared at Madison's side almost instantly, his expression controlled, the way it became when markets fell or journalists asked honest questions. Naomi, he said under his breath, this is not the place. For what? She asked. For truth. His jaw tightened. For drama. Naomi glanced around the ballroom, at the donors sipping champagne, at the board members pretending not to listen, at the oversized portrait of Charles's father watching from above the mantel, as if legacy could excuse cruelty. Then her eyes returned to her husband. You printed the drama on cardstock and mailed it across the country. A few feet away, an older woman lowered her glass. Madison's cheeks warmed beneath her perfect makeup, but Charles stepped closer, his voice dropping into warning. Do not make this ugly. Naomi's face remained calm. You already did. I am only making it honest. Before he could answer, dinner was announced, and the guests moved toward the long table beneath the chandeliers. Naomi saw it immediately. Her place card had been moved 3 seats down from Charles, near a retired banker who had once asked whether she had been hired to manage the event. Madison's card sat at Charles's right hand, where Naomi had sat for a decade. The insult was so precise it almost looked accidental. Almost. Naomi walked to the table, lifted Madison's place card between 2 fingers, and studied the gold lettering as if it were an exhibit in poor judgment. Then she set it back exactly where it had been. She did not argue. She did not rearrange the room. She simply turned to the guests, raised her glass, and let the chandelier light catch the pearl at her throat. Merry Christmas, she said, her voice clear and warm. May we all learn to honor the people who stood beside us before the cameras arrived. No one moved. Even Charles seemed unable to breathe. Naomi placed the untouched glass on the table, gathered her coat from Evelyn, and walked toward the front doors with the quiet certainty of a woman who had just closed a chapter no apology could reopen. Behind her, the orchestra began playing again, but the music sounded thinner now. For the first time in his life, Charles Whitmore did not fear his wife's anger. He feared her peace. Naomi did not file in December. That was what surprised everyone later, when the story began moving through private dining rooms and corporate elevators in softened voices. They expected a woman humiliated at her own Christmas table to react before midnight, to send a furious message, to walk into Charles's office, to make the kind of scene that would allow him to call her emotional and himself reasonable. But Naomi had learned long ago that powerful men often survived by turning a woman's pain into evidence against her. So she gave him nothing. No pleading. No public statement. No midnight call. She spent the last days of December in a quiet apartment on the Upper West Side that belonged to an old college friend who asked no questions and made tea without being asked. Snow gathered on the fire escapes. Church bells rang on Christmas morning. Families dragged pine trees to the curb after New Year's Day. And Naomi worked. She opened the old laptop Charles had once called outdated and began building a timeline with the calm precision of a woman who understood that truth, when organized well, could become stronger than outrage. She saved copies of emails where Madison approved charity materials under Naomi's name. She printed board minutes showing how Charles had shifted decision-making power away from her without formal notice. She gathered donor correspondence, event budgets, photographs, invitations, bank statements, and the final proof of the card that had told the world exactly what Charles thought she was worth. Every document went into a navy folder labeled Simply January. On the 27th floor of a glass building near Columbus Circle, Grace Monroe studied that folder across a polished conference table and did not interrupt once. Grace was not the kind of lawyer who performed sympathy. She wore a gray suit, square glasses, and the composed expression of a woman who had watched too many people confuse divorce with failure. When Naomi finished, Grace placed both hands on the folder and said, "You are not trying to punish him. You are trying to stop disappearing." Naomi looked toward the window, where Central Park lay pale and frozen beneath the morning light. "I thought leaving men I had lost," she admitted. Grace shook her head. "Leaving with clarity is not losing. Sometimes it is the first honest decision a person makes after years of being managed." The words settled into Naomi like warm water over a bruise. For years, Charles had made every room feel like a courtroom where she had to prove she was calm enough, grateful enough, elegant enough, forgiving enough. Now, for the first time, someone was not asking her to soften the truth so it would not inconvenience him. Grace explained the process carefully: marital property, reputation rights, misuse of charitable identity, independent accounting, personal assets, public exposure, private dignity. Nothing dramatic, nothing reckless, just law, fact, and timing. Naomi listened, took notes, and asked questions with the steady focus she had once used to build Charles's public image. By the time she left Grace's office, the sun had dropped behind the buildings, and the sidewalks shone with melted snow. Her phone showed 7 missed calls from Charles. There was also one message: "Come home before this becomes embarrassing." Naomi stood beneath the awning, reading those words while yellow cabs moved through the slush and strangers hurried past carrying groceries, flowers, and ordinary lives. Embarrassing. Not heartbreaking. Not wrong. Not unforgivable. Only embarrassing. She locked the phone without answering. That evening, in the small apartment, she removed the Whitmore name from her email signature. Then she opened a blank document and typed her own name at the top: Naomi Brooks. It looked simple. It looked unfamiliar. It looked like a door. For the first time since the card arrived, she slept through the night. On the morning of January 8th, Charles Whitmore stood at the head of the 40th floor boardroom, as if the year itself had been waiting for his permission to begin. Manhattan stretched behind him in glass and steel, the Hudson River dull beneath a winter sky, while 12 board members sat around the long walnut table with tablets, coffee, and the careful patience of people who knew wealth could make even silence feel expensive. Madison Pierce sat 2 chairs from him in a white blazer, her hair pinned flawlessly, her folder open to the communications plan she had titled "A Stronger Whitmore Future." Charles liked that phrase. Stronger. Future. Words with no apology inside them. He was speaking about first quarter projections when the conference room doors opened. His executive assistant stepped in, pale but professional, holding a sealed envelope. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "this was delivered by legal courier. It requires your immediate attention." A small irritation crossed his face. Charles hated interruptions unless he had arranged them. He took the envelope, broke the seal with one clean motion, and began reading. For a moment, nothing changed except his eyes. Then the color drained from his expression so quietly that Madison leaned forward before she could stop herself. The first page was formal, exact, and devastating. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Naomi Brooks Whitmore versus Charles Andrew Whitmore. Filed in the Supreme Court of the State of New York. Attached to it was a request for independent review of marital assets, personal image usage, foundation governance, and all financial decisions made by Whitmore Charitable Trust during the previous 18 months. Charles read the words again, slower this time, as if they might become less real through repetition. They did not. Across the table, board member Helen Armitage adjusted her glasses. "Charles, is there a problem?" He closed the folder, but not before one director saw Naomi's name printed across the top. News moved through powerful rooms without needing sound. Madison's polished confidence faltered, her fingers tightening around her pen. "Perhaps we should take 5 minutes," she said lightly, but no one followed her lead. The room had already shifted. Charles, who had built his empire on control, had been served in front of the people who measured control for a living. His phone began vibrating against the table. Once, twice, then again and again. Not Naomi. Reporters. A donor from Boston. A hospital board chair in Chicago. His private attorney. The Christmas photograph, which Madison had insisted would modernize his public image, had done something else entirely. It had given people a question they could not politely ignore. Where was Naomi? And why had the woman who built the heart of Whitmore's philanthropy walked away right after the holidays? Charles excused himself with a voice made of stone and entered the private office beside the boardroom. Madison followed without being invited. "This can be contained," she said quickly. "We frame it as a private family transition. Mutual respect. New chapter. No one needs details." Charles turned to her slowly. She requested a foundation audit. Madison went still. Just a fraction. Just enough. He noticed. 4 years. Naomi had warned him that charity was not decoration, that poor record-keeping was not a harmless mistake, that donors trusted them because she made sure every dollar had a purpose and every name had dignity. He had dismissed her concerns as emotional over-involvement. Madison had called them old-fashioned. Now those ignored warnings were sitting in a legal filing with Naomi's signature beneath them. In the Upper West Side apartment, Naomi sat at a small wooden table with Grace Monroe on speakerphone and a cup of coffee cooling beside her. She was not smiling. This was not triumph, not the kind people imagined when they spoke about revenge. Her hands were steady, but her heart carried the weight of 10 years ending in black ink. "He has received it," Grace said. Naomi looked toward the window, where ordinary people moved along the sidewalk in winter coats, carrying laundry, pushing strollers, walking dogs, living lives that did not require permission from a man in a boardroom. "Good," Naomi answered softly. She touched the navy folder marked January, then slid the Christmas card into the back pocket of the file. It was no longer a wound. It was evidence. Charles had thought she was leaving a marriage. By noon, he would understand she was also taking the truth with her. Naomi left the Whitmore estate with less than people expected. No diamond collection, no designer luggage stacked like a performance, no dramatic final walk through rooms built to impress strangers. On a cold Thursday morning, while the city was still rubbing sleep from its windows, she returned with Grace Monroe, one moving company, and a written inventory. Evelyn Carter met her at the door with red eyes and a thermos of coffee, saying nothing because there are some losses too sacred for small talk. Naomi took her mother's pearl pendant, 3 boxes of books, the old laptop Charles had mocked, framed photographs of community events, and a worn leather notebook filled with names. Not donor names, not board names, real names. Women who had whispered to her after luncheons, in restroom corners, beside elevator banks, telling pieces of stories they were afraid to say out loud. A teacher whose husband controlled every credit card. A nurse who had been told she was ungrateful for wanting her own savings account. A young mother who stayed in a marriage because she thought leaving meant failing her children. For years, Naomi had written their names carefully, adding phone numbers, shelters, lawyers, scholarship leads, child care programs, and notes beside each one. Charles had called it Your Little Kindness Project. Naomi had called it Remembering. By February, that notebook became the beginning of something no one in Charles's world could reduce to a brand strategy. She rented a modest office above a bakery in Harlem where the heat rattled loudly through old pipes and the front windows looked down on a bus stop crowded with working people each morning. The sign on the door was simple, the Brooks Foundation. The first donation came from Naomi's own savings. The second came from a retired school principal in Queens who sent a check for $50 with a note that read, "Help somebody stand up straight again." Naomi taped that note inside her desk drawer, not because it was the largest gift, but because it was the truest. She hired 2 part-time counselors, 1 financial coach, and a receptionist named Marisol who kept peppermint tea and tissues in the waiting room, but never treated tears like weakness. The foundation did not promise miracles. It offered practical dignity, emergency transportation, legal referrals, financial literacy workshops, resume help, therapy vouchers, and quiet rooms where women could hear themselves think without being corrected. Naomi worked 12-hour days, sometimes 14, but the exhaustion felt different now. It did not shrink her. It returned her to herself. Reporters began calling by the 3rd week. At first, Naomi declined. She knew the public loved a wounded wife more than a rebuilding woman, and she refused to become entertainment for people who would forget her by the next news cycle. But when a local public radio host asked to discuss financial control in marriage and the importance of community support, Naomi agreed. She arrived wearing a navy coat, her curls loose around her shoulders, no wedding ring, no bitterness in her voice. The host asked whether she wanted people to feel sorry for her. Naomi paused, thinking of the ballroom, the card, the empty place where her name should have been. Then she said, "I do not want pity. Pity looks down. Respect stands beside. What I want is for every woman listening to understand that dignity is not something you receive after someone chooses you. It is something you protect, especially when someone tries to make you invisible." The clip traveled farther than she expected. Emails arrived from Ohio, Georgia, California, and small towns she had never visited. Women wrote that they had opened separate bank accounts, called counselors, apologized to themselves, or simply slept better after hearing a stranger name what they had been feeling for years. Naomi printed some of those messages and pinned them to the office wall, not as trophies, but as proof that pain could become shelter when handled with care. Meanwhile, Charles watched from a penthouse office where every surface shined and nothing felt warm. He saw her name trending beside words he had never given her enough credit for: founder, advocate, leader. For the first time, the woman he had erased was being seen without him standing in the frame. Madison Pierce had wanted the crown, but she had never understood its weight. In December, standing beside Charles beneath silver garlands and camera flashes, she had imagined power would feel like applause. She thought Naomi's absence would leave an open chair she could simply claim, a name card she could move, a room she could enter without earning the trust that once held it together. By February, the truth had begun arriving in quiet humiliations. The first donor withdrew after a polite email that mentioned a change in philanthropic direction. The second requested a full accounting of last year's winter relief fund. The third called Charles directly and asked why Naomi was no longer overseeing community partnerships. No one accused Madison of anything outright. That was the cruelty of refined society. They simply stopped returning calls. At Whitmore Charitable Trust, Madison tried to replace relationship with language. She ordered new branding materials, softened the website colors, rewrote the mission statement, and scheduled a private luncheon at a midtown hotel with white orchids on every table. But when the doors opened, half the seats remained empty. The women who had once embraced Naomi near coat drives and scholarship dinners sent assistants instead. The hospital director from Chicago stayed for 14 minutes, checked his watch twice, and left before dessert. Madison smiled through it all, but her smile had started to look expensive rather than warm. Charles watched from the end of the table, saying little. He had spent years believing presence was interchangeable, that any elegant woman could stand beside him if the lighting was right and the dress was tasteful. Now he saw what Naomi had carried without asking to be praised. She had remembered birthdays, children's surgeries, donor grief, scholarship deadlines, the names of receptionists, the food allergies of board members, and which wealthy widow needed to be asked about her late husband before anyone mentioned money. She had not managed charity. She had honored people. Madison could draft a statement. Naomi had built trust. One afternoon, Charles returned to his office after a difficult call with the Boston Children's Fund and found the Christmas card still propped against a stack of unopened invitations. He had kept it there out of stubbornness at first, then habit, then something darker he did not want to name. The photograph looked different now. Madison's red dress no longer seemed bold. His own smile no longer seemed confident. The space where Naomi should have stood had become the loudest thing in the frame. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and found a folder Naomi had left behind months earlier, probably by accident, though later he wondered whether she had known he would eventually need to see it. Inside were drafts of speeches, handwritten notes, and a list titled People We Must Not Forget. Not partners, not prospects, people. Beside each name, Naomi had written something specific. Mrs. Alvarez needs wheelchair access for the gala. Tyler wants to study engineering, not business. Ask Mr. Graham about his wife's garden. Do not mention donation amount before asking how the shelter repairs are going. Charles sat with the folder open for a long time as the city darkened beyond the windows. He remembered telling Naomi she made everything too personal. He remembered her answer. That is because people are personal. Across town, Madison was preparing another media plan, insisting the public would move on if they controlled the narrative long enough. But the public was not the real problem. The problem was that the people who mattered had already known the truth before the headlines did. They had known which woman stayed after events to thank the kitchen staff. They had known who answered calls when cameras were gone. They had known who treated dignity as a practice, not a slogan. That evening, Charles looked again at the card and finally understood what he had mistaken for victory. He had not introduced Madison to the world. He had shown the world exactly who he was willing to erase. By late March, the first gala for the Brooks Foundation had outgrown the modest ballroom Naomi originally booked above a community arts center, not because she wanted grandeur, but because the waiting list kept growing. A retired judge offered a larger venue near Lincoln Center at a reduced cost. A caterer donated dinner. A florist from Brooklyn filled the tables with white tulips, and 3 women Naomi had helped insisted on volunteering at the welcome desk because, as one of them said, "You gave us a door. Let us hold one open for somebody else." Naomi arrived before sunset, wearing an ivory dress with clean lines and her mother's pearl pendant resting at her throat. She did not choose ivory to look innocent. She chose it because she no longer needed armor. The room glowed with warm light, not the cold glitter of the Whitmore estate, but something gentler, something alive. There were teachers, nurses, attorneys, small business owners, social workers, donors, neighbors, and women who had once sat quietly in Naomi's office holding paper cups of peppermint tea while trying to remember the sound of their own voices. On each table was a card printed with the foundation's first promise: your dignity is not negotiable. Charles arrived 10 minutes before the program began. He came alone, in a dark suit, without Madison, without photographers, without the easy authority that usually entered rooms before he did. At the registration table, Marisol looked for his name, found none, and politely directed him to a seat near the back that had opened after a last-minute cancellation. For once, Charles did not ask to be moved. He sat beneath the soft balcony lights and watched people greet Naomi not with flattery, but with gratitude. They touched her hands. They looked her in the eyes. They spoke to her as if she had changed something real. When Naomi stepped onto the stage, the applause rose slowly, then fully, until the sound seemed to lift the ceiling. She waited, one hand resting on the podium, her face calm beneath the lights. Charles remembered other stages, other speeches, his voice speaking words she had written. This time, every word belonged to her. "There are many ways a person can disappear," Naomi began. "Sometimes it happens loudly, through betrayal or public shame. But more often, it happens quietly. A choice made without you. A bank account you cannot access. A room where your work is praised only when someone else claims it. A photograph where your absence says more than your presence ever could." The room stilled. No one looked at Charles directly, but he felt the truth move toward him anyway. Naomi continued, her voice steady, not bitter, not fragile, but clear enough to reach the farthest table. She spoke about financial education, emotional safety, legal access, and the sacred importance of listening before judging. She spoke about women who stayed too long because they were afraid, and women who left with nothing but a folder, a bus ticket, and the hope that somebody would believe them. She did not name Charles. She did not name Madison. She did not have to. Her restraint was more powerful than accusation. Near the end, Naomi looked across the room, not at one person, but at everyone. Respect is not a luxury reserved for the wealthy. It is not a gift handed down by the powerful. It is the basic language of human worth. When we deny it to another person, we do not make them smaller. We reveal the size of our own heart. The applause came like a tide. People stood. Some wiped their eyes. Others simply placed a hand over their chest, as if the words had touched something they had almost forgotten. Charles remained seated for 1 second too long, then stood with the rest of them, slowly, humbled in a way no business loss had ever humbled him. Under the lights, Naomi looked peaceful, not because she had won against him, but because she had returned to herself. And Charles finally understood that she had not taken revenge by destroying his name. She had done something far more devastating. She had built a room where his money meant less than her truth. After the gala, Naomi stayed behind until the last tulip arrangement had been wrapped for volunteers and the final folding chair had been stacked against the wall. She had always believed the end of an important night revealed more than the beginning. Anyone could smile beneath chandeliers. Character lived in the quiet hour after applause, when people helped carry boxes, thanked the staff, and noticed what still needed care. She was standing near the side entrance, signing a receipt for the donated sound equipment, when Charles approached. He stopped several feet away, as if the distance between them had finally become something he respected. For a moment, neither spoke. Outside the glass doors, March rain silvered the sidewalk, and yellow cabs moved through the city like small lanterns. Charles looked older than he had at Christmas, not ruined, not defeated, simply stripped of the certainty that had once made him seem untouchable. "Naomi," he said, and her name sounded different in his mouth now, less like something he owned and more like something he had lost the right to hold. She turned toward him with calm eyes. "Charles." He glanced toward the empty ballroom, where the foundation banner still hung above the stage. "You were extraordinary tonight." A softer version of herself might have thanked him too quickly. The old Naomi might have searched his face for proof that he still saw her. This Naomi simply nodded. The work is extraordinary. I am only learning how to serve it well. His jaw moved as if he had prepared a speech and discovered, too late, that prepared words could not carry honest regret. I was cruel, he said. Not only with the card. Before that, for years, I made you smaller so I could feel larger. I let people praise me for your heart. I treated your patience like permission. Naomi listened without interrupting. Grace had once told her that closure was not always an answer. Sometimes it was the ability to hear an apology without needing it to rebuild the house that hurt you. Charles drew a careful breath. Madison is gone. The board asked her to resign after the audit. We are restructuring the trust. Every program you built will be credited properly. He looked down, then back at her. I know that does not repair what I did. No, Naomi said gently. It does not. The truth landed between them without cruelty. Charles accepted it, and that acceptance was the first decent thing he had done in a long time. Is there any part of you, he asked quietly, that could ever forgive me? Naomi looked past him toward the tables where women had left handwritten cards beside their empty coffee cups, notes of gratitude, courage, and beginnings. She thought of the estate hallway, the missing ornaments, the chair moved away from his side, the ring resting beside a photograph that had tried to erase her. Then she thought of the office above the Harlem bakery, the retired principal's $50 check, Marisol's peppermint tea, the women who walked in bent by shame and left standing a little straighter. I already have, she said. Charles closed his eyes for half a second, relief breaking across his face. But Naomi raised one hand, not harshly, only clearly. Forgiveness is not an invitation to return. It is a decision not to carry you into the life I am building. The rain tapped softly against the glass. Charles nodded, and this time he did not argue. Months later, the divorce was finalized in a quiet conference room with signatures, witnesses, and no performance. Naomi left with her name, her foundation, and a peace that did not depend on being chosen. Charles returned to a mansion that still looked grand from the outside, but he no longer mistook grandeur for love. By the following December, the Brooks Foundation had helped more than 400 women with legal aid, emergency planning, counseling, and financial education. Naomi sent out a holiday card of her own, printed on simple cream paper, no crest, no mansion, no borrowed perfection. The photograph showed her standing in the foundation office beside staff members, volunteers, and women whose faces carried the quiet light of survival. Evelyn Carter stood near her shoulder, smiling like family. At the bottom, in navy ink, were the words, "A family is not who stands beside you for the camera. It is who protects your dignity when no one is watching." When Charles received one in the mail, he sat alone in his office for a long time, holding the card with both hands. There was no bitterness in it. That was what made it unforgettable. Naomi had not become powerful because she stopped loving. She became powerful because she finally learned that love without respect is only decoration, and she had not been born to decorate anyone's life. She had been born to build her own.